I shouldn't have opened that door, but the rain wasn't just falling. It was hunting me, each drop slamming against my skin like it wanted me to stop, to freeze, to get caught. And I couldn't. I was already running at full speed down a half-flooded street, sneakers slipping on slick pavement, my breath coming out in sharp, broken gasps as thunder cracked somewhere too close. And behind me, headlights cut through the storm like something alive, something patient, something that knew I was running. Out of time. My phone had died 10 minutes ago, screen black, no signal, no help, just me and the sound of tires somewhere back there, steady, not rushing, which made it worse, because it meant they didn't need to rush. They knew I couldn't keep this up much longer, and maybe they were right, because my lungs burned and my legs were starting to shake when I saw it. A black SUV idling at the curb, engine low, almost silent beneath the storm, its windows tinted so dark they reflected nothing but lightning. And I didn't think, I didn't check, I didn't hesitate. I just yanked the door open and slid inside, pulling it shut behind me, as if that alone could erase everything chasing me. The shift was immediate, like stepping into another world. The rain muted, the air warm, leather seats soft beneath my soaked clothes, and for 1 second, just one, I thought I was safe, until I heard it, a quiet, deliberate click that echoed louder than the thunder outside. The doors locked. My heart stopped, then slammed back to life so hard it hurt as I turned my head slowly, afraid of what I'd see. And he was already looking at me, like he'd been waiting, like I'd walked into something carefully arranged. He sat in the back seat, not the driver's, which made it worse, posture relaxed, one arm resting along the side. Dark suit perfectly untouched by the storm, not a single drop of water on him. Like the rain itself knew better than to get close. And his eyes, steady, unreadable, held mine without effort. "Who are you running from?" he asked, voice low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be obeyed. And I opened my mouth, but nothing came out because the truth was I didn't know how to explain it in a way that didn't sound insane, didn't sound like I'd just thrown myself into something worse. The headlights behind us grew brighter, reflecting through the rain-streaked glass, and I flinched instinctively. But he didn't even glance back, didn't shift, didn't react, just watched me like the rest of the world was background noise. "Please," I managed, my voice shaking despite everything I tried to do to steady it. "I thought this was an Uber." "I didn't mean," he tilted his head slightly, not interrupting, just observing, like my fear was data he was collecting. Outside, the car behind us edged closer, its presence pressing against the edges of the moment. But inside, it felt like time had slowed, stretched thin between my racing heartbeat and his impossible calm. Then, finally, he moved, just enough to lean forward, the faintest shift, but it changed everything, like gravity had tilted in his direction. "You don't get into the wrong car by accident," he said softly, and something in the way he said it made my stomach drop. Not threatening, not loud, just certain, like he already knew more about me than I did. The engine beneath us purred slightly louder, and I realized, too late, that we were already moving, pulling away from the curb, away from the street, away from whatever had been chasing me, and straight into something I didn't understand, something I couldn't control. I glanced back one last time, watching those headlights struggle to keep up through the storm, and when I turned forward again, his eyes were still on me, unblinking, patient, like he had all the time in the world, like I had just stepped into a story that wasn't mine to leave. And that was the moment I understood. I hadn't escaped anything. I had just changed who I belonged to. I did not realize I was holding my breath until the car turned left without signaling and the city lights disappeared behind sheets of rain, replaced by quieter streets and longer stretches of darkness, the kind that made everything feel farther away from help. And my fingers tightened against the edge of the seat as I forced myself to speak again, to say something that might give me control over a situation that was slipping further from my grasp with every passing second. "Please, just let me out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I will walk. I will call someone. I just need to get away from them." And this time his gaze shifted, not away, but slightly downward, like he was considering the weight of my words rather than reacting to them. And that somehow made it worse, because panic I understood, anger I understood, but this calm, this measured silence, felt like standing in front of something I could not predict. Outside, The headlights that had followed me were still there, faint but persistent, cutting through the storm. Like a reminder that whatever I had run from had not given up yet, and I saw it then. The smallest change in his posture, a subtle straightening, a quiet decision forming without urgency, as if he had already calculated every possible outcome and chosen the one he preferred. "You think getting out will make you safe," he said finally, his voice even, almost thoughtful, and I swallowed hard. Because he did not phrase it as a question. "It will not," he continued, and the certainty in those two words settled over me heavier than the rain outside, and before I could respond, the car accelerated smoothly, not fast enough to feel reckless, but deliberate, controlled, like every movement of the vehicle answered only to him. I turned slightly, glancing through the rear window, watching as the distance between us and the other car stretched, then shortened again, a silent chase that never quite became chaos, just tension tightening and releasing like a held breath, and my heart mirrored it. Pounding, slowing, then pounding again. "Why are they following me?" I asked, more to fill the silence than because I expected an answer, but he surprised me by responding immediately. "Because you saw something you were not supposed to see," he said, and I froze, the memory flashing back so sharply it made my chest tighten. The alley, the voices, the moment I realized I should not be there, and I had run before understanding what I had walked into. And now it felt like that decision had followed me here, into this car, into this man's presence. "I did not mean to," I whispered, and for the first time, my voice broke, not from fear alone but from the realization that meaning did not matter anymore. And he studied me for a long second, his expression unreadable but not cruel, not impatient, just focused. Like he was deciding something important. The car slowed slightly as we approached an intersection where the traffic light blinked yellow through the storm, casting brief flashes of color across his face, highlighting the sharp lines, the control, the absence of doubt. And then he leaned back again, that same effortless composure returning as if nothing outside could reach him. "Intent does not change consequence," he said quietly, and I felt those words settle somewhere deep, uncomfortable, and undeniable. And when I looked at him again, really looked, I understood something I had not wanted to admit, that this was not just a man giving me a ride, not just a stranger caught in my chaos. This was someone who existed above it, who shaped outcomes instead of reacting to them. And the terrifying part was not that he had locked the doors, it was that a small, traitorous part of me was starting to believe him when he said I would not be safe anywhere else. And as the car turned again, deeper into streets I did not recognize, the storm outside raging harder than before, I realized I was no longer trying to find a way out of the car. I was trying to understand the man who had just taken control of where I would end up. The moment I stopped asking where we were going was the moment I realized he had never intended to tell me. And the city outside had changed again, the streets wider now, quieter, lined with buildings that looked untouched by time, their windows dark except for the occasional glow behind heavy curtains, and it felt wrong. Like I had crossed into a part of the city that did not belong to people like me. The kind of place you passed by without noticing, unless someone brought you there on purpose. I shifted slightly in my seat, my damp clothes clinging uncomfortably to my skin as the warmth of the car settled in, and I became aware of every small detail, the faint scent of leather and something sharper beneath it, the steady hum of the engine, the controlled way the driver followed each turn without hesitation. Like this route had been memorized long ago. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, quieter this time, not demanding, just needing something to hold on to. And for a second, I thought he might ignore me. But then his gaze flicked toward the window before returning to me, calm as ever. "Somewhere they will not follow," he said, and I wanted to believe that was enough. But the truth was, I did not know if being out of their reach meant being safe with him. The car slowed as a set of iron gates appeared ahead, tall and silent, and before I could process it, they were already opening, not rushed, not questioned, just responding. And something about that unsettled me more than anything else so far, because it meant this place, whatever it was prepared for him, expecting him. We passed through, and the world shifted again, the noise of the storm fading into something distant, muted by distance and design, and the driveway curved gently, leading us toward a structure that rose out of the darkness like it had always been there, solid, unshaken, untouched by everything outside its boundaries. I swallowed, my pulse quickening again, not from the chase this time, but from the realization that I was being brought somewhere permanent, somewhere that did not feel like a temporary stop or a quick favor. The car came to a smooth stop, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the silence stretching, heavy but not uncomfortable for him. Only for me, because I did not know what came next. Then he spoke again, his voice as steady as before. "You can keep asking questions," he said, not unkindly. "But the answers will not change what already happened." And I felt that, the truth of it, pressing against my thoughts, because he was right. I had already stepped into his world the second I opened that door, and there was no version of this where I simply walked away unchanged. I looked at the door handle, then back at him, expecting him to stop me, to remind me of the lock, but instead, he simply watched, giving nothing away, and that almost felt like permission, or maybe a test. And my hand hesitated before I finally reached out, fingers brushing the cool metal. It did not move, not locked, not resisting, just waiting, like the choice was mine, even if the outcome was not. I exhaled slowly, my breath shaky despite everything I tried to hold together, and turned back to him, because suddenly, stepping out felt less certain than staying. And I hated that, hated how quickly my instincts were shifting, how the fear outside was beginning to feel more dangerous than the unknown sitting beside me. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, and for the first time, something changed in his expression, not softer, not kinder, just more focused, like we had reached the part he had been waiting for all along. He leaned forward slightly, the movement controlled, deliberate, and held my gaze without blinking. "Now," he said quietly, "you stop running." And the way he said it made my chest tighten, not like a command, but like a decision already made, and I realized then that whatever I thought, this was, whatever I believed I had control over, none of it mattered anymore, because this was not about where I wanted to go. It was about where he had decided I belonged. The moment I stepped out of the car, I realized the storm could not reach me here, like the rain itself had been stopped at the gates, left behind with everything else I no longer had control over. And the silence that replaced it felt heavier than the noise ever had, pressing in around me as my shoes touched the dry stone beneath the covered entrance, my breath still uneven, my thoughts trying to catch up to a reality that kept shifting faster than I could process. I glanced back instinctively, half expecting the headlights from before to break through the darkness, to follow me all the way here, but there was nothing, just the long empty driveway disappearing behind us. And that absence should have made me feel relieved, but it did not, because now there was nothing to distract me from where I was and who I was standing with. The door of the house opened before I could reach for it, smooth and silent, like someone had been watching, waiting for our arrival, and I hesitated at the threshold, my body refusing to move forward even as I knew there was nowhere else to go. And for a brief second, I considered turning back, running into the storm again, choosing chaos over certainty, but the memory of those headlights stopped me, holding me in place. "You are safe here," he said behind me, his voice calm, closer now, and I felt it more than I heard. It, a quiet certainty that did not ask for trust but expected compliance, and I turned slightly, enough to meet his eyes again, searching for something human, something uncertain, but all I found was control, absolute and unshaken. "Safe does not mean free," I replied before I could stop myself, the words slipping out sharper than I intended, and for the first time, there was the faintest pause in him, not anger, not surprise, just acknowledgement, like I had said something worth noting. "No," he agreed after a moment, his tone unchanged. "It does not." And that honesty unsettled me more than any reassurance could have, because it meant he was not pretending this was something it was not. I stepped inside slowly, the warmth of the space wrapping around me in a way that felt too deliberate, too controlled, like even the air had been designed to calm me down. And the contrast between this place and the storm outside made my head spin, everything here precise, quiet, untouched, while I stood there soaked, shaking, completely out of place. I wrapped my arms around myself without thinking, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. And I hated that he could see it, that he could read it without effort. Footsteps echoed somewhere deeper in the house, measured and distant, and I realized we were not alone, that this place was not empty, just controlled, like everything else about him, and my chest tightened again, not from fear. Exactly, but from the realization that I had stepped into something much larger than a single moment or a single mistake. "You can leave if you want," he said suddenly, and the words caught me off guard so completely that I turned to him fully, searching his face for any sign that this was a test, a trap, anything other than what it sounded like. But his expression did not change, did not shift, just watched me with that same steady focus, like the choice itself was what mattered, not the outcome. I glanced toward the open door behind me, the dark driveway beyond it, the distant sound of rain barely reaching this far. And for a second, I imagined walking out, stepping back into the storm, trying to outrun something I did not understand, and my body did not move. Instead, I looked back at him, because despite everything, despite the fear, despite the unknown, there was something here that felt more certain than the world I had just left behind, and that terrified me more than anything else, because it meant I was already changing, already adapting to a reality I had never meant to enter. "If I leave," I said slowly, forcing the words out, "they will still be out there." And he held my gaze, unblinking, as if waiting for me to reach the conclusion on my own. And when I did, when the truth settled fully into place, I felt it like a quiet surrender I had not agreed to. And he gave the smallest nod, not as permission, but as confirmation, like he had known from the beginning exactly how this would unfold. And I realized then that stepping into his car had not just changed my night. It had changed the rules I was living by, and I was already too far inside it to pretend otherwise. The silence inside the house did not feel empty. It felt watched, like every step I took was being measured against something I could not see. And I became aware of the sound of my own breathing again, too loud in a place this controlled, too human in a space that felt designed to eliminate unpredictability. And I forced myself to slow down, to match the calm that seemed to exist everywhere here except inside me. I stayed near the entrance longer than necessary, my fingers still slightly curled, as if I had not fully decided whether I was staying or leaving, even though we both already knew the answer, and I could feel his presence behind me without needing to turn, steady, patient, not pushing, not rushing, just waiting for me to catch up to a decision he had already made. "You planned this," I said quietly, the thought forming before I could stop it, and I turned just enough to see his expression, searching for denial, for anything that would make this feel less deliberate, but he only watched me, that same composed focus in his eyes. "I plan everything," he replied, not defensive, not proud, just factual, and something in my chest tightened at the implication, because if everything was planned, then my arrival here was not as random as I wanted to believe. "Even me?" I asked before I could second-guess it, and for the first time since I had stepped into that car, there was a pause that felt different, not uncertainty, but something more precise, like he was choosing his words with greater care. "No," he said finally, and the honesty in it surprised me again. "But now that you are here, nothing about this is accidental anymore." And the weight of that settled over me in a way I could not easily shake. I looked away, taking in more of the space around me. The clean lines, the quiet order, the subtle signs that this place was not just lived in but controlled down to the smallest detail. And it made me feel even more out of place, like I was the only unpredictable element in a system that did not tolerate unpredictability. Footsteps approached from deeper inside the house, slow, respectful, and I tensed instinctively until a man in a dark suit appeared at the edge of the hallway, stopping a few feet away without speaking, his posture straight, his eyes briefly flicking to me before returning to the man behind me, waiting for instruction rather than acting on his own. "She will stay," he said simply, and there was no hesitation, no question, just a quiet acknowledgement from the other man before he turned and disappeared again, as if that single sentence had already set something into motion that could not be undone. I turned back to him, my pulse picking up again, not from immediate danger, but from the realization that decisions about me were being made without me, and yet I had not protested, had not demanded anything more than answers I knew he would not give. "You do not even know my name," I said, the words sharper now, holding on to the one piece of identity that still felt like mine. and his gaze held mine, steady, unflinching. "Emily," he said, and the sound of it in his voice made my stomach drop, not because of how he said it, but because he already knew, and of course he did. Of course someone like him would not leave. Something like that unknown. How? I asked, even though I already understood the answer would not make me feel better, and he took a step closer, not enough to invade, but enough to make the distance between us feel intentional. "Because the moment you stepped into my car," he said quietly, "you became my responsibility." And there it was again, that word, not possession, not threat, but something heavier, something that sounded almost protective and yet just as binding. And I did not know which part unsettled me more. I swallowed, my thoughts racing as I tried to hold on to something stable, something that made sense in a situation that refused to follow any rules I understood. And when I looked at him again, really looked, I realized that this was not about keeping me here against my will. It was about making it so that leaving no longer felt like a choice I could take. And that realization lingered in the space between us, quiet and undeniable, as the storm outside continued to rage somewhere far beyond the walls that now stood between me and everything I used to know. The way he said my name did not feel like recognition. It felt like confirmation, like something had been checked off a list I had never seen. And I hated how that made me feel smaller in a space that was already swallowing me whole. So I straightened slightly, forcing myself to hold his gaze instead of shrinking under it. Because if there was one thing I still controlled, it was how I responded. "Responsibility is not the same as permission," I said, my voice steadier now, sharper, and for a brief second, the corner of his expression shifted, not quite a smile, not quite approval, but something that suggested he had expected resistance, maybe even welcomed it. "No," he said calmly, "it is not." And then he turned slightly, gesturing toward the hallway as if the conversation had already moved forward without me, as if my defiance had been noted and filed away rather than challenged. "You are cold," he added, and the simplicity of the statement caught me off guard, because it was true. My clothes still damp, my skin chilled beneath the warmth of the house, and I wrapped my arms around myself again instinctively, hating that he had noticed something so small, something so human. "I am fine," I replied quickly, more out of habit than truth, but he did not argue, did not insist, just watched me for a moment longer before speaking again. "You will be given something dry to wear," he said, not as a suggestion, not as a kindness, but as a decision already made. And before I could respond, footsteps returned, the same quiet presence from before appearing again at the edge of the space, waiting without interrupting. "Prepare a room," he said, his voice low but absolute, and the man nodded once before disappearing again without question, without delay, and I felt that same shift in the air, like something had been set in motion again, something I had no control over. "I do not need a room," I said quickly, the words spilling out before I could stop them, because a room meant staying, meant settling into something I was not ready to accept. And he looked at me again, that steady, unreadable gaze holding mine as if weighing my refusal against something larger. "You need rest," he said simply, and I shook my head, taking a step back, trying to create space that did not exist. "I need to leave," I corrected, even though the words felt weaker than before, less certain. And he did not move, did not close the distance, just stood there with that same impossible calm, like time worked differently around him. "You will not leave tonight," he said, not harshly, not forcefully, just as a fact, and something in me flared at that, frustration cutting through the fear for the first time. "You cannot decide that for me," I said, my voice rising slightly, the tension finally breaking through. And for a moment, the silence that followed felt different, charged, like I had stepped into something I did not fully understand. But he did not react the way I expected, did not step closer, did not raise his voice. Instead, he exhaled slowly, almost like patience rather than irritation, and his eyes held mine in a way that made everything else fade again. "I already did," he said quietly, and there was no threat in it, no anger, just certainty. The kind that did not need to prove itself because it had already been proven. My breath caught, the weight of that settling over me in a way that made it hard to argue, not because I agreed, but because a part of me understood that arguing would not change anything, not tonight, not here. I looked past him for a second, toward the hallway, toward the parts of the house I had not seen yet, and I realized how little I actually knew about where I was, about who he was beyond the control he carried so effortlessly, and that uncertainty pressed against my chest again, heavier now, more complicated than fear alone. When I looked back at him, I forced myself to speak more carefully, more deliberately, because if I was staying, even temporarily, I needed something, anything, that belonged to me in this situation. Then tell me your name, I said, holding his gaze, refusing to look away this time. And for the first time since I had stepped into that car, the silence that followed felt like it meant something more, like I had finally asked the question that mattered, and he watched me for a long second before answering, his voice low, steady, impossible to ignore. Alexander, he said, and the way he said it felt less like an introduction and more like a line I had just crossed, one that I could not step back over no matter how much I might want to. The way his name settled into the air changed something between us, subtle but undeniable, like the space itself had adjusted to it, and I repeated it silently in my mind, testing how it felt, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone I was now connected to whether I wanted to be or not. And that realization sat heavier than anything else that had happened tonight. Alexander, I said quietly, the sound of it unfamiliar on my tongue, and his gaze held mine with that same steady focus, like he was measuring the way I accepted it, the way I reacted to it, and I hated how aware I was becoming of every small shift between us, every glance, every pause. The man from before returned then, appearing just as silently as he had left, stopping at a respectful distance. The room is ready, he said, his voice low, controlled, and I felt my stomach tighten again at how quickly things moved around Alexander, how easily decisions turned into actions without hesitation. Alexander nodded once, not even looking away from me, and that small gesture carried more authority than anything louder could have, and I realized then that this place did not just belong to him. It moved for him, adjusted for him, existed in response to him. You should change, he said, his tone softer now, but no less certain, and I glanced down at myself, at the damp fabric clinging uncomfortably, at the reminder of everything that had happened before I stepped into his car, and for a second, I hesitated, because accepting anything from him felt like giving up something I could not define. I do not have anything else, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended, and something in his expression shifted again, not pity, not sympathy, just recognition, like he had expected that answer too. You do now, he replied, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten in a different way, not fear this time, but something more complicated, something I did not want to name. I followed the man down the hallway, my steps slower than his, my eyes taking in everything around me without meaning to, the quiet elegance, the order, the absence of anything out of place. And it made me feel even more aware of myself, of how much I did not belong here, how easily I stood out against everything that had been designed to fit a different world. The room he led me to was warm, softly lit, nothing excessive, but everything deliberate. And when the door closed behind me, the silence felt different again, not watched this time, just still, like a space waiting for me to decide who I was going to be inside it. I stood there for a moment, not moving, my hands still slightly trembling from everything that had not had time to settle yet. And then I noticed the clothes laid out on the bed, simple, dry, exactly my size, and that made my breath catch, because it meant someone had anticipated this, had prepared for it, and I did not know if that should comfort me or scare me more. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing the fabric, grounding myself in something real, something I could touch, and for the first time since the storm, I allowed myself to pause, just for a second, just enough to breathe without feeling like I was being chased. But even then, even in the quiet, my mind kept circling back to him, to the way he had watched me, to the way he had spoken, to the way everything here moved in response to him, and I realized that changing into dry clothes would not change the reality I had stepped into, would not reset anything, would not give me back the life I had left behind on that rain-soaked street. I glanced toward the door, half expecting it to open again, half expecting him to be there, but it remained closed, giving me a privacy that felt almost intentional, almost strategic, like he was giving me space not out of kindness, but because he understood that I would not run, Not anymore. Not tonight. And as I stood there, holding onto the edge of something familiar in a place that was anything but, I realized that the storm outside had only been the beginning, and whatever came next would not be something I could outrun, because it was already waiting for me on the other side of that door, and his name was the only warning I was going to get. I did not realize how much of the storm I was still carrying until the door clicked shut behind me and the silence pressed in, not loud, not heavy, just complete, like this room had never known chaos. And for a moment I stood there, completely still, listening to nothing but my own breathing as it slowly began to steady, the tension in my chest loosening just enough for me to feel how tired I actually was. I changed slowly, almost mechanically, peeling away the damp fabric that clung to me, replacing it with something warm, dry, unfamiliar but oddly fitting, like it had been chosen without needing to ask. And that thought lingered longer than I wanted it to, because it meant someone had paid attention, had anticipated what I would need before I even realized it myself. When I finally sat down on the edge of the bed, the softness beneath me felt unreal, too comfortable compared to everything that had happened just hours ago, and I pressed my hands into the fabric as if to ground myself, to remind myself that this was real, that I had not imagined any of it. But my mind would not stay quiet. It kept circling back to him, to the way he spoke, to the way he watched without needing to say much, to the way everything seemed to move around him without resistance. And I tried to make sense of it, tried to place him into something familiar, something I could understand, but nothing fit. A soft knock broke the silence, not loud, not urgent, just enough to pull me back, and my body tensed instantly before I could stop it, my eyes snapping to the door as if I expected it to open without waiting. But it did not. It stayed closed, the knock coming again, patient this time, controlled. "Yes," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, and the door opened just enough for a tray to be placed inside. The same man from before, stepping in briefly, his movements precise, respectful, leaving without lingering, without asking anything. And the door closed again just as softly as it had opened. I stared at the tray for a second, the simple presence of food grounding in a way I had not expected, because it was normal, ordinary, something that did not belong to whatever world I had just stepped into, and yet it was here, placed for me like everything else had been. I stood slowly, walking toward it, my steps careful, as if the quiet might break if I moved too quickly, and I realized then how strange it was that no one had forced me into anything. No one had raised their voice. No one had needed to. And somehow that made everything feel more controlled, more deliberate. I picked up the glass of water, the cool surface steady in my hand, and took a small sip, letting the normalcy of it settle my thoughts for just a moment. But even then, I could not fully relax, because there was a presence here that did not need to be seen to be felt. I set the glass down slowly, turning slightly toward the door again, and without knowing why, I stepped closer, my fingers hovering just above the handle, not opening it, just feeling the distance between staying inside and stepping back out into whatever waited beyond, and my chest tightened again, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, something more uncertain. I did not know how long I stood there before I finally pulled my hand back, choosing stillness over action, choosing to wait instead of run. And that choice felt heavier than any decision I had made before, because it meant I was beginning to understand the rules of this place, even if no one had explained them to me. I moved back toward the center of the room, slower this time, more aware, and as I sat down again, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else, that for the first time since the storm began, I did not feel like I was being chased anymore, and that should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like something else entirely, like I had not escaped the danger. I had simply stepped into a place where it could not reach me without permission, and I was starting to understand exactly who decided that. Sleep did not come easily, not in a place that felt too quiet to be real, not when every time I closed my eyes I could still see the rain, still hear the distant echo of tires behind me. But eventually exhaustion won, pulling me under just enough to blur the edges of everything until I was no longer sure what was memory and what was fear. When I woke, it was not to noise, not to movement, but to light, soft and filtered through tall windows I had not noticed before, and for a moment I did not move, my mind slow to catch up, my body still expecting urgency that was no longer there. And that was when it hit me. The stillness, complete and controlled, like the world outside had been paused without asking my permission. I sat up slowly, the unfamiliar bed beneath me grounding and disorienting at the same time, and I looked around the room again, seeing it differently now in daylight, the details sharper, more deliberate. Everything placed with intention, nothing accidental, and it made me feel like I was inside something designed rather than lived in. I swung my legs over the side, my feet touching the floor with a hesitation I could not explain, like standing meant accepting where I was, meant stepping fully into a reality I had not chosen, and I stayed there for a second longer than necessary before finally pushing myself up. The clothes from last night were gone, replaced by something new, neatly folded, and I stared at them for a moment, that same realization returning, that everything I needed was already here before I asked for it, before I even thought about it, and that should have felt comforting, but instead it made me feel observed in a way I could not ignore. I dressed slowly, my movements deliberate, trying to hold on to some sense of control in the smallest ways possible, and when I finished, I walked toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle again. The same hesitation from before returning, only this time it felt different, less about fear and more about what came next. I opened it. The hallway beyond was quiet, just as controlled as everything else, and I stepped out carefully, my senses sharper now, more aware, listening for anything that might give me a clue about this place, about him, about what I had stepped into. I did not have to wait long. He was already there, standing at the far end of the hallway as if he had been expecting me to appear at that exact moment. His posture unchanged, his presence just as steady as it had been the night before, untouched by time or rest, and when his eyes met mine, it felt like the distance between us closed without either of us moving. "You slept," he said, not a question, just an observation, and I nodded once, unsure what answer he expected, unsure what I was supposed to say in a place where everything seemed to be known before it was spoken. "I did," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended, and I took a step forward before stopping myself, aware again of how easily I was beginning to follow his rhythm instead of my own. He watched me for a second, then took a step toward me, the movement slow, controlled, not threatening, but intentional, like everything else about him, and I felt that same shift again, that same pull I could not quite explain. "Good," he said, his tone even. "You will need your strength," and the words settled into the space between us in a way that made my chest tighten, not from fear, not exactly, but from the implication behind them, from the sense that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, it was only just beginning. I held his gaze, forcing myself not to look away this time, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that looking away meant giving up more than I was ready to lose. And I took a slow breath, steadying myself as best as I could. "For what?" I asked. And for the first time since I had met him, there was a pause that felt heavier than the others, not longer, not uncertain, but more deliberate, like the answer mattered in a way nothing else had yet. He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the detail in his expression, the control, the certainty, the absence of hesitation. And when he spoke, his voice was low, calm, and impossible to ignore. "For understanding why they were following you," he said, and the words hit me harder than anything else had, because in that moment, I realized something I had been avoiding since the beginning, that this was never just about where I ended up. It was about what I had walked into before I ever opened that car door. And whatever it was, he already knew, and I did not.